Little I. Doesn't it seem strange, a title for a poem? Well, that exactly is what E. Cummings does in all his poetry. He is a great experimental poet. An American poet, of course, but since we have looked at a number of American poems, I'm not going to talk about the age. I'm going to talk about instead introducing you to the idea of experimental poetry. All of us know experimenting is doing something new, is doing something different. And this is what poets too do. You can experiment with theme, you can experiment with form. Well, our poet experiments with a kind of grammar that he uses, punctuation that he uses, vocabulary that he uses, quite influenced by the avant-garde of the period. Interested in calligraphy, E. Cummings is a great experimental poet. I'm sure as we go along, we will see more and more of that. Edward Estlin Cummings, 1894 to 1962, an American poet, painter, essayist, playwright, etc. Just imagine, he wrote 2,900 poems, also plays, travelogue, a collection of short stories. In an interview, he tells us that he began writing at the age of 8. And till 22, imagine, he wrote daily. That was a part of his routine. He had been an ambulance driver during World War II. But as a poet, what he did was, he wrote what we can call modernist free-form poetry. Idiosyncratic syntax very often, lowercase spelling. As one critic said, he seemed to split the atom of cute commonplace. Phonologically, he did a lot of innovation. His vocabulary is full of unusual compounds. Can you imagine a word like puddle wonderful, mud luscious, and so on and so forth? Of course, as we do the poem, you will see more and more of it. Who are you, little I? Indeed, a very little poem. So let me have the pleasure of reading out to you. Remember, the best way to appreciate a poem, as I have said ever so often, is to read it aloud. Who are you, little I? 5 or 6 years old, peering from some high window at the gold of November sunset, and feeling that if day has to become night, this is a beautiful way. That's all. That's what the poem is about. The little I. If you look at the poem, you will notice that the I here, we have been told, I is always with a capital I. But here notice, it's a little I. It's not capitalized. Imagine this is a little boy, a little child, and the poem tells us maybe he's 5 or 6 years old. Well, if he is a little child, who is writing the poem? Think of yourself, my dear listeners, viewers, readers, friends. Very often we love to look at ourselves when we were younger. Of course, it needs much more imagination to look at ourselves as somebody older, what we have not experienced. But our past, what we have already experienced, is much easier. So here we have the poet, maybe 30, 40, whatever age you are in, you can imagine, looking at yourself when you were 5 or 6 years old. Wasn't there an innocence? Wasn't there a sense of wonderment at everything around us? So here, this little I this young kid, boy or girl, whatever you would like to imagine, who's 5 or 6 years old, probably climbing onto a stool, probably trying to be taller than he is actually, and peering out of the window. The world outside attracts the child. The child is curious. The child is inquisitive. The child wants to know what's going on outside in the wide, wide world. And therefore, he's peering out of the window. And the poet says, some high window. And therefore, I want you to imagine the scene when you are not tall enough to look out of the window. And therefore, you have to make yourself taller and peer out. And what are you looking at? At the gold of November sunset. I think all of us have our favorite seasons. All of us have our favorite parts of the day. Well, sunrise and sunset, you must admit, are absolutely beautiful from the nature point of view. And then November, because remember, we are not talking of India, we are talking of maybe some Western country, the US, because he is an American poet. So we have November sunset, autumn. Autumn twilights are indeed beautiful. So he peers out and he looks at the world outside. And then you're asking yourself, what happens after day? After all, it's night. I've already mentioned twilight. The sun is setting. And therefore, he looks out and he says, oh, the day is becoming night. The transformation, the slow transformation. And he says, for that change, can there be a better part of the day? So the poem ends, this is a beautiful way for day to become night. Who are you, little I? The little kid who is now an adult. A short poem with a very simple rhyme scheme. A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D. Can't be an easier rhyme scheme. And therefore, I, high, old, gold, day, way, sunset, night. Doesn't rhyme so much, I agree. But well, poets do have the line. Alright, the themes, as we can see, are about the innocence of a child. It's about the beauty of nature. It's about importance of change, meaningful change, I would call it. The tone of the poem is one of informality. There is a visual unity because we are looking at nature outside. You would notice I'm not mentioning the usual traditional figures of speech because they aren't really there in this poem. The speaker, of course, is someone who is looking at his younger days. The words, the vocabulary is simple, though we generally talk about his experimentation. And in passing, I just want to mention that this poet who comes across as such an innocent, simple child here has often been accused of using caste slurs. Because in many of his poems, we come across words like nigger, Yankee, etc. I'm just mentioning this to you because when we look at poetry today, sometimes we tend to criticize it from our point of view, the age in which we live. But my dear viewers, I do want to tell you, always remember to appreciate poetry by looking at the age in which it was originally written. So 100 years ago, theories might have been different. But just appreciate the poem for what it is. When you read a poem, when I read a poem, at the end of it probably, I'm left with a question. What makes a poem a poem? Is it the length of the poem? Well, do remember, epics are also poems. And our epics run into hundreds of thousands of lines. And then you have a short poem like this. But you know, when I read this poem the first time, And in fact, I must admit, each time I read the poem, I think I smile. Because Cummings' idea of the little I comes to my eye. There's a pun on the word. I'm talking of the I with the E by E-I. And then I look at myself as a child. I look at the world around me and see all those little kids with the innocence of childhood trying to understand the big, big world around us. Did you have the same feeling when you heard this poem?